আপনাদের সকলকে আবারও আমন্ত্রণ ক্রিমিনাল জাস্টিস প্রোগ্রাম দেখবার জন্য। আমি আজাম কো সলিসিটার্স এর প্রিন্সিপাল সলিসিটর শাফিউল আজম এবং আমার সাথে আছেন ক্রিমিনাল লয়ার স্পেশালিস্ট ব্যারিস্টার আমার কলিগ ব্যারিস্টার লিন টাউনলি। আমরা এই সেগমেন্টে বলবো একটা অপারেশন, একটা পুলিশি অভিযান যেটাকে বলে অপারেশন স্টপউড, এবং একটা কেসের উপরে আমরা বলবো। 7 men have been found guilty of grooming and exploiting young girls. 7 জনকে আপনার জুরি, ক্রাউন কোর্টের জুরি গিলটি, দোষী সাব্যস্ত করেছিল of grooming and exploiting young girls, যে গ্রুমিং করার জন্য এবং এক্সপ্লয়েট করার জন্য, শোষণ করার জন্য, তাদেরকে শোষণ করার জন্য, ব্যবহার করার জন্য। এবং গ্রুমিং মানে যে দেখানো যে আমি তোমার বয়ফ্রেন্ড, আমি তোমার হাজব্যান্ডের মতো, মানে এরকম একটা গ্রুমিং করা, তাকে এমন একটা কনফিডেন্স, মানে তার পুরো একটা গ্রুমিং করা বলা হয় এটাকে, যে তোমার আমি একদম তোমার হাজব্যান্ডের মতো, তোমার আমার বয়ফ্রেন্ডের মতো, আমরা খুবই ক্লোজ, এবং তাকে এইভাবে এগুলো করে শোষণ করছে, তাকে ব্যবহার করছে। ইনক্লুডিং one who was sexually abused by at least 100 Asian men, এবং একটা মেয়েকে যাকে সেক্সুয়ালি অ্যাবিউজ করা হয়েছিল, যাকে মানে সেক্সুয়ালি আপনার যৌনভাবে যাকে নির্যাতন করা হয়েছিল, এবং যাকে অ্যাটলিস্ট 100 এশিয়ান ম্যান, এবং মানে 100 মানুষের মতো একজনের পর আরেকজনে, হ্যাঁ, বিফোর দ্য এজ অফ 16, যে সে 16 বছর হওয়ার আগে প্রায় তাকে মানে একজনের থেকে আরেকজনের কাছে পাস করা হয়েছিল বিভিন্ন সময়ে, প্রায় 100 জনের কাছে। Sheffield Crown Court heard how the men targeted and exploited the teenagers. শেফিল্ড ক্রাউন কোর্ট এই কেসটা শুনেছিল, এই কেসটা হয়েছিল 2018 সালে, এবং তারা শুনছিল কিভাবে 7 জন মানুষ টিনেজারদেরকে, ইয়াং মেয়েদেরকে টার্গেট করেছিল এবং এক্সপ্লয়েট করেছিল, সেক্সুয়ালি অ্যাবিউজ করেছিল, শোষণ করেছিল, শোষিত করা, এটা হইল কি আপনার মানে এক্সপ্লয়েট করা, before subjecting them to acts of degrading and violent nature. এবং তারা এমন ভাবে তাকে টার্গেট করেছিল, তাদেরকে খুব ডিগ্রেডিং বিহেভিয়ার করেছিল, অ্যাক্ট অফ ডিগ্রেডিং, এবং হিংস্র ভাবে তাদের উপরে আচরণ করেছিল, সেক্সুয়াল অ্যাবিউজ। They abused 5 young girls over a 7-year period in Rotherham. রদারামের মধ্যে 5 বছর মানে 5টা ইয়াং মেয়েকে আপনার 7 বছর ধরে তারা অ্যাবিউজ করেছিল। এটা খুবই আপনার বড় কেস। বিবিসির মধ্যে, বিভিন্ন নিউজের মধ্যে, বিভিন্ন আপনার পত্রপত্রিকার মধ্যে এই কেসটা অনেকবার আসছিল, অনেকবার এটা ছাপানো হয়েছিল। এটাকে বলা হয় অপারেশন স্টপউড, পুলিশি অভিযান। লিন, I will pass to you to talk on the operation Stopwood. You know that the 7 men have been found guilty of grooming and exploiting young girls, including one who was sexually abused by at least 100 Asian men before the age of 16. Talk about this operation Stopwood, please.
The operation itself, it went on for, well, it dealt with things that were going on from 1997 until 2013, and it involved at the end of the day up to well, they think that there were about 1,400 girls in all who were abused during this period of 16 years. So at the end, only 7 men were actually charged and went to trial in the end, but there were a lot more clearly involved. That was the extent of the evidence that they could get. They could only get enough evidence to charge the 7. But Shafi, as you have said, the targeted girls, they were all between 13 and 16, that sort of age group. And they were plied with drugs, alcohol, even food, and I'll come back to why the food element is relevant, because it is. And also, given small amounts of money, and also the perpetrators then manipulated the young girls to make them believe that they were either their friends or boyfriend. So that they flattered the girls, made them think that they were important, that they were in proper relationships with them, boyfriend, that they cared, and so on. And the sole reason for this was in order to be able to allow themselves and their other associates to sexually abuse the girls. So there were a number of offences, different sexual offences committed over the years on the numerous victims, from it was indecent assault, which became sexual assault because it bridged over a period when the law on sexual offences changed. So from sort of the lower levels of sexual assault right up to and including rape, the men were charged with those, and also procuring sexual intercourse with minors as well, with young girls, was another one of the charges. Now, the reason that they targeted these particular girls was to do with the fact that they were extremely vulnerable. Some of them had at least mild learning difficulties. They were all living in areas where there was extreme poverty, so that's why plying the girls with food on occasions was relevant, because many of them were living in extreme poverty, and that they were targeted because of that, made them vulnerable. And then they later plied the girls with drugs and alcohol, which then facilitated and enabled a number of the sexual offences to occur, because the girls were under the influence of alcohol and or drugs, or both at the time while the offences were being committed. So the difficulty was initially for the investigation, and the investigation was undertaken at the end of the day by officers from the National Crime Agency, which is, if you like, a specialist top police agency in the country that deals with particularly complex and large investigations. So they're an elite squad, as it were, and they were needed in this case because there were two problems. First of all, there was a conspiracy of silence amongst the individuals that they were interviewing, and sophisticated denials and so on. But the main problem was that the victims themselves, because they were severely affected by the abuse, took their trauma along with them as they got older and into adulthood, and they made they were very vulnerable. So as witnesses, they come across and as perhaps shall we say difficult to convince juries, because they were so vulnerable and traumatized by what happened to them that many of them felt that they couldn't give evidence. Eventually they did get a number of the victims to give evidence, but a lot of them didn't present as the most compelling. And the problem was that in the early stages and even as the investigation progressed, lawyers that were involved in advising the National Crime Agency and the officers were concerned about how the witnesses would come over on the stand, what might be thought about them by the juries. And indeed, the investigation stalled on a number of occasions because of that. So what needed to happen was that in the end, individual officers were able to gain the trust of the victims and basically to give them confidence that the system would support them, wouldn't let them down, and would help them through the court process. And because of their own vulnerability, they found that it to be a stressful and difficult experience. So there were a lot of lessons learned about presenting vulnerable witnesses, and also about pursuing cases even where on the face of it the actual victims may not have presented themselves in a light where individuals or lawyers felt they could put them forward as credible. And actually, when the case eventually got to court, a lot of the stereotypes around what makes good and credible witnesses in these types of sexual abuse cases were shattered, because the individuals in the end were believed, and they'd often been doubted, or maybe not their personal accounts, but there was concern amongst the lawyers who were advising in this case initially that they would simply come across in a way that the jury wouldn't accept that they were victims. And they had then, in the face of that, they had compelling accounts, of course, by the much older perpetrators, who then presented themselves as being family men, and who wouldn't be involved in doing these types of actions, or that their involvement had been misinterpreted by the girls, because what many of them said was that sexual acts had occurred, but they were entirely consensual. So it all boiled down in the end to what we've talked about a number of times on this programme, about one word against another, and then the issue is who is believed. So a very difficult trial, a very difficult case to bring. Lots of again, the witnesses and the complainants who give evidence remained very vulnerable, and at any stage may have pulled out just through being too afraid to give evidence, or the stress of the whole situation being something that they, in their vulnerable state following years of abuse, couldn't handle. But in the end, they were supported, and they were able to give their evidence, and their evidence was believed. But it was a very difficult trial to run, and the whole operation, the Stovewood operation, took a number of years to put everything together. But at the end of the day, only 7 men were convicted. There were a lot more involved. And looking at social services involvement and what the police had found out, there may have been up to 1,400 girls abused in one way or another are involved with what had gone on, and meaning that the majority of the victims didn't actually see any justice for what had happened to them. But it was it was and will remain a hugely significant case, and significant not only because it did achieve justice for some of the victims, but also that it demolished a lot of the stereotypes about what does a victim look like, what should a victim look like. And in future, the lessons learned from it can't be underestimated, because just because someone presents in many ways as damaged and flawed and traumatized, and as someone perhaps, who has used drugs and so on, and alcohol, and might in many ways be demolished by cross-examination. It still doesn't mean that they make a bad and unconvincing witness. And at the end of the day, all 7 men were convicted and sentenced, some of them between 10 and 23 years in prison. So this is a hugely significant case and a big step forward in the way that the police investigate child abuse, and also about the way that the system as a whole views individuals who are complainants, and whether they believe complainants or not. So it's irrelevant what the background, what the background is around, say, drug abuse, alcohol, their own background themselves. This case showed that a jury can actually look beyond all that and can see people as victims of circumstance, and see how the abuse itself did turn the victims into what they were, and not the other way around. They were introduced to drugs, by the perpetrators, and this in turn left them with lifelong trauma. So, I mean, that's essentially it in a nutshell, Shafi. So, quite a major case and breakthrough in the way that sexual assaults and on this scale are investigated.
Okay.
And also a major breakthrough in infiltrating this gang of individuals and stopping them continuing the abuse into the future, which would have happened had it not been for the outcome of this case.
Okay, I have one thing. Is this Operation Stovewood, is it still ongoing?
Well, it started, the investigation started in 2014. I'm not sure whether there's still, I mean, obviously, if there are still cases and so on that are open, the police will continue to investigate if anyone else comes forward, and that they will continue to investigate individual claims if other people come forward.
Okay. Now, Operation Stovewood is the largest law enforcement investigation into non-familial child sexual exploitation in the UK. দর্শক, এইটা হইল খুব একটা বড় এনফোর্সমেন্ট আন্ডার পুলিশের ইনভেস্টিগেশন অপারেশন স্টোভউড, যেটা হইল একটা বড় একটা পুলিশের অভিযান যেটা নন ফ্যামিলিয়াল চাইল্ড সেক্সুয়াল এক্সপ্লয়টেশনের উপরে তারা ইনভেস্টিগেশন করতেছিল। তার মানে নন রিলেটেড, ফ্যামিলির মধ্যে না, ফ্যামিলির বাইরে নন রিলেটেড মানে চাইল্ড অ্যাবিউজ নিয়ে। Lim, can you talk for the viewers what is non-familial child sexual exploitation?
Sorry, Shafi, could you repeat that? I couldn't hear.
If you can explain to the viewers, the Operation Stovewood is the largest law enforcement investigation into non-familial child sexual exploitation in the UK. So what is non-familial child sexual exploitation?
Okay, well, in this case, with child abuse, what is often the case is that child abuse and sexual abuse of children often occurs within a close family setting, or within a setting where the perpetrators are known to the victims but may not be family. But generally, when we're looking at things like this type of exploitation, it tends to be familial. So in this case, it was unusual because it involved individuals who were living in the wider community, and they targeted these victims because they they saw them, they came into their shops, they came into their restaurants, and they were aware of the vulnerability of a lot of these children that lived in the vicinity. So what actually happened was initially it was disclosures that were made to some of the children's key workers about boyfriends and older boyfriends and what was going on, and the key workers began to unearth what actually was in fact a very large network of older Asian men who were involved in exploiting over a long period of years a number of children, so girls, always around 13 to 16. So girls that they had known from the area and targeted due to their vulnerability, and the girls themselves were passed around a number of the Asian men and their friends. So Shafi, you mentioned in one case that one of the victims was raped by at least 100 men. Together very systematically to continue the abuse of again a large number of children, but to use them for basically sexual abuse. So the group of men were either perpetrators, or they were facilitating the sexual abuse for their friends, or encouraging it within a large group. So there was a number of things in common with the way that they perpetrated the abuse. It was always the vulnerable that they preyed on, so very young girls, but people with the girls had learning difficulties. They were extremely vulnerable because of their background. So a lot of them were from extremely poor families. So they could even the chance of getting free food was something that would have been a lever for the men to have used against them. And they were sexually abused, and threats were used. So, for example, what the men did on a number of occasions was that they would threaten the girls that they were going to drive them to remote locations that the girls didn't know and leave them.
Yeah, we have to go for a break now. Yeah, we'll get back to that point in the next segment again.
Okay.
দর্শক, আমরা একটা ব্রেকে যাচ্ছি, ব্রেকের পরে আমরা আবার আসবো। আমি আজাম এন্ড কো সলিসিটরস এর প্রিন্সিপাল সলিসিটর শাফিউল আজম, এবং আমার সাথে আছেন আমার কলিগ ব্যারিস্টার লিন টাউনলি। সবাই আমাদের সাথেই থাকুন।